Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 382. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well and happy to have you back on today. We got a lot of important news to talk about. Just want to jump right into it after we remind people that the show is hosted through the Libertarian Institute, and just putting the show out there to new people. If you're new to the show, make sure you're subscribed to the show. All that stuff really does help us out, and we appreciate it anytime you do it. And with that, I got just a couple stories before I hand it over to Connor today, but some important news, some very big news. Zelensky tells McCall and Schultz to supply game-changing weapons to Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky met with the French President Macron and the German Chancellor Scholz in Paris on Wednesday, where he made a fresh pitch for fighter jets and other advanced weapons. France and Germany have potential to be game changers, and that's how I see our talks today. The sooner we get heavy, long-range weapons and our pilots get modern planes, the quicker this Russian aggression will end, Zelensky said in Paris. Zelensky said the weapons are needed for peace, reflecting recent comments made by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who recently claimed that sending more arms to Ukraine is the quickest path to peace. Scholz told Zelensky that Germany and its allies will back Ukraine as long as necessary, but gave no indication he changed his position on sending fighter jets. The German leader ruled out sending advanced aircraft to Kiev, but he previously ruled out sending heavy tanks, and now Ukraine is receiving over 200 German-made Leopard 1 and Leopard 2 tanks. Speaking alongside Zelensky, Macron said Russia must not win the war and that Kiev could rely on France. Russia cannot and must not win this war. As long as Russia continues to attack, we will continue to adapt and moderate the necessary military support to preserve Ukraine and its future, the French leader said. Zelensky traveled to Paris after visiting London and met with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who seemed eager to provide Kiev with fighter jets. The British Prime Minister said the UK would begin training Ukrainians on how to fly NATO aircraft this spring, although London has not yet pledged that it will give its own jets to Ukraine. Zelensky visits on Wednesday mark his first known trips outside of Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. Besides his December visit to Washington, D.C. on Thursday, he is expected to meet with EU officials in Brussels. So, Connor, I think this is extremely significant, and this is something that I've been talking about on the show for, I guess, over a month now, that I do think Western-made jets or some kind of planes will be going to Ukraine, and now I get the indication that it's going to be Western-made jets. Now, previously I had talked about that, maybe they're planning on transferring more Soviet-era weapons to Ukraine, and then they'll backfill some NATO countries who had the Soviet-era planes with new NATO weaponry, and they'll send those weapons to Ukraine. But the fact that they're receiving training from the UK makes me believe the Ukrainian pilots will eventually be flying warplanes that were manufactured in some NATO country. This is going to be a huge escalation in this war. At one point or throughout most of this war, Connor, we've been talking about the U.S. limiting Ukraine to receiving either artillery pieces, rockets with a range of 50 miles, but now they're already planning to send Ukraine with rockets and bombs with the range of about 100 miles, but we'll be talking about hundreds of miles with these warplanes the U.S. or the Ukrainian forces will be able to fly and drop their bombs. This is going to be seen as, a significant escalation by the Kremlin. We've already had the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, make it clear that the Russian policy in how much territory of Ukraine they plan to take is going to be based at least somewhat on the range of weapons that the Ukrainians receive. And so if Kiev is getting fighter jets, I'm not sure how far Russia is willing to take it, but my guess is we'll see massive bombing of Ukraine's infrastructure as Russia attempts to make sure that, the fighter jets cannot be effective on the battlefield. So this This is a huge escalation, and it's very concerning, Connor. I don't know when the fighter jets will actually end up getting to Ukraine. My guess is that, of all the complicated weaponry the West is sending to Ukraine, the aircraft is going to be the most complicated, just because you're not just talking about maintenance. You're not just talking about figuring out how to work the radars. There is a lot of like muscle training that actually goes into flying these aircraft. It's not just that, you hold the controls and go straight. You have to have your feet pressed down on the pedals with the exact same pressure all the time. And this is very critical to flying the plane. There's a lot of muscle memory that goes into it. They're very complicated to operate. So I'm not sure how long it's going to take, if we're looking at years, or 18 months, 2 years before these planes end up reaching the battlefield. But it does seem to be coming. And of course, Russia isn't going to wait until the planes start reaching Ukraine. Once these announcements are made, Russia is going to start acting in a way as if, Ukraine is going to receive these weapons very soon. I think, to in any way possible prevent the weapons from eventually reaching Ukraine. Now, I have one update on the last show, Connor, and this is, again, one of the most important things that we've talked about on the show. From the time that I've been doing this may be the most criminal act American president has carried out. I mean, I know nobody died here, and there's been plenty of times, like, even going back in the beginning of the Biden administration, the bombing in downtown Kabul and things like that. But, we are talking about the U.S. blowing up a pipeline and then blaming Russia, potentially, escalating us and actually escalating us very much closer to World War III, and, risking nuclear war here. And this is how far they're willing to push it. So Dave DeCamp writes at antiwar.com, Russia looking for answers after report says Biden blew up Nordstream. Russia is looking for answers from Washington after a report from Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh said the U.S. blew up the Nordstream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia and Germany. The White House must now comment on these facts, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said on Telegram in a response to the report. For their part, the White House has denied the reporting, calling Hersh's work a complete fiction. Hersh cited one source with direct knowledge of the operational planning who said the U.S. Navy divers planted C4 explosives on the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines last June during widely publicized NATO drills in the Baltic Sea known as Baltops 22. This source told Hersh that the operation was coordinated with Norway. The explosives were detonated by a sonar buoy that was dropped by a Norwegian spy plane on December 26, 2022. The most explosive allegation in the report is the fact that the Biden administration began planning on how to destroy the pipeline before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. In early 2022, the source said the CIA working group that was coming up with ways to sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline said they have a way to blow up the pipeline. Shortly after the plans were devised, President Biden publicly threatened the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a project the U.S. tried to stop through sanctions. If Russia invades, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We will bring an end to it, Biden said on February 7th, 2022. A few weeks earlier, Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, made a similar threat. Hersh's source said Nuland and Biden's comments were likely putting an atomic bomb on the ground in Tokyo and telling the Japanese that they were going to detonate it. In the wake of the Nord Stream bombings, Western media said some Western officials blamed the attack on Russia, even though the pipelines are mainly owned by Gazprom, Russia's state natural gas company, but recently it's been acknowledged by major American newspapers, the New York Times and Washington Post included, that there is no evidence pointing to Moscow's involvement. The Times of London reported last week that Germany is open to theories that a Western country attacked the Nord Stream pipelines in an attempt to blame the incident on Russia. Sweden, Denmark, and Germany have been investigating the sabotage, but have shared very few details and have not said publicly who they think was responsible. U.S. officials have openly celebrated the Nord Stream bombings, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who called it a tremendous opportunity to wean Russia off Europe off Russian natural gas. Nuland recently said she and others in the administration were happy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was just a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Hersh's report said that Blinken, Nuland, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan were major players in the plot to destroy the pipeline. While the White House and CIA denied the report, and its critics are pointing out that it only has one source, Hersh is a widely revered journalist. The 85-year-old exposed the 1968 My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War and broke the story about the torture prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. So, Connor, I broke down this article, and there's actually, I was on the Fault Lines radio show this morning. It's mainly broadcast in Washington, D.C., but they do, put up all the shows online. And I discussed the article with the host there. One thing that the hosts were discussing with me was, what are the chances for accountability here, us actually finding the truth? And on the show, I'm pretty pessimistic. I put the chances as pretty low. One of the things in Hersh's article is, pointing out that Ted Cruz is part of the reason that this happened, which makes me think that the Republicans aren't going to be too into, getting to the bottom of this. But at the same time, I did see today that Mike Lee put out a tweet on this. And, maybe the best hope for finding out the truth is the fact that a significant amount of this pipeline, while 51% was owned by Russia, 49% was owned by European companies, and maybe they're interested in filing lawsuits and trying to get to the truth here. But at the same time, they could probably be bought off. And with that, let me hand it over to you, Connor, to talk about what's happening in the U.S.-China relationship.
Absolutely. So this one's from Dave DeCamp on yesterday on the 8th. So after Biden's State of the Union address, I didn't watch it, but I've read all the quotes on foreign policy, and it was relegated to a very small part, a few hundred words on China and Russia each. No mention of our ongoing wars in the Middle East, in Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, etc. But he went after China again. This is very reminiscent of Biden's previous rhetoric. I believe it was his first congressional address where he said that we're going to win the 21st century in this competition with China, and that we are now in extreme competition. And on my watch, there's no way that China will ever become the most powerful country economically and militarily and whatever else he said. There was a lot of rhetoric about this stuff at the beginning of the Biden administration, particularly, people like General Mark Milley, who would say, just completely come right out and say that the thing here is that no country has ever been able to challenge the United States' dominance over the global, or the economic affairs, political affairs, military affairs, and cultural affairs of the globe. And so what they're going to do now is repress the rise of China. And this is what is the foreign ministry spokeswoman here from China is getting at in regards to Biden's speech. So this is, China says it was smeared in Biden's State of the Union address. So on Wednesday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spoke out against President Biden's State of the Union address, where he took aim at Beijing and said the competition with China should unite Americans, should unite all Americans, he said. Now, China does not, this is the Foreign Ministry spokesman Mao Ning speaking. She says, China does not shy away or flinch from competition. However, we are opposed to defining the entire China U.S. relations by competition. And this is what the Biden administration does all the time. In fact, Biden even made the point in his State of the Union address that I assured Xi that we want competition and not conflict. And of course, as you pointed out on the previous show, at the same time that it's blatantly obvious to everyone paying attention, especially Beijing, that the U.S. is indeed preparing for war. And Biden has explicitly said that they are prepared to go to war over Taiwan. Of course, we're just encircling them with more and more bases, particularly now with these additional bases in the Philippines. And there's going to be more expansion in Micronesia and places like this in the Pacific Islands. Now, so she says, it is beneath a responsible country to use competition as a pretext to smear other countries and restrain their legitimate right to development, even at the expense of global industrial and supply chain, she added, referring to the recent U.S. sanctions targeting China, attempting to kneecap their semiconductor industry. and the additional pressure that we've applied on allies like Japan and the Netherlands to withhold critical technology that China needs for its chip industry. And so U.S.-China relations are at their lowest point in decades, certainly since 1979. The U.S. has been increasing sanctions and is expanding the military footprint in the Asia Pacific. This is the Asia pivot that Obama launched, and boosting support for Taiwan. Mao said that a healthy and stable China-U.S. relationship is the fundamental interest of both peoples. U.S. and Chinese officials recently made an effort to increase dialogue, but of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his planned trip to China over the Chinese meteorological balloon that was spotted over the United States. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin tried to phone his Chinese counterpart after a U.S. F-22 fighter jet shot down the balloon. However, Pentagon officials said that Beijing wouldn't accept the call. China insists that the balloon the U.S. shot down was only used to track weather for civilian purposes, while the Pentagon claims it was a spying device. And of course, the Pentagon is still yet to provide any evidence for that accusation. All right, so we're going to get more to this competition paradigm here toward later on. But for right now, let's look at this next piece. Representative McCall plans to visit Taiwan this spring, and McCarthy will follow him later. So this is, again, from Dave DeCamp yesterday at antiwar.com. Representative Michael McCall, Republican out of Texas, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has said that he plans to lead a bipartisan congressional delegation to Taiwan this spring, despite the risk of provoking China. McCall is a massive hawk. He's been, his big beef with Biden is for, quote, slow walking military aid to Ukraine and not giving them the equipment to support, real assault on Crimea, that they need longer range weapons so that they can just really attack Crimea more effectively. McCall says, I think it's important to show China that we support Taiwan as a deterrence. I think it's important to do that, McCall said Tuesday, according to Bloomberg. While increasing U.S. support for Taiwan is done in the name of deterrence, it has increased Chinese military pressure on the island. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last August, of course, provoked the largest ever military exercises around the island, and Beijing has kept up the pressure. Of course, they fired missiles over the island, simulated a blockade, and now regularly fly warplanes over the median line that sort of it's a drawn line that divides the strait about halfway, which they hardly ever did, going back as far as the 50s until now with this trip from Pelosi. It's become a almost daily occurrence. And China views congressional visits to Taiwan as an affront to the One China policy, especially when a high-level lawmaker like the Speaker of the House is involved. But the increased tensions as a result of Pelosi's trip has not deterred her successor. Representative Kevin McCarthy also plans to make the trek to Taipei. A source told Bloomberg that McCall's visit will likely take place during the congressional recess in April. McCarthy's trip will come after that, either later this year or sometime in 2024. McCall said that he plans to join the House Speaker whenever he decides to go. Now, Beijing has urged McCarthy not to visit Taiwan as Pelosi did last year, to which he responded, I don't think China can tell me where I can go at any time, at any place. Now, despite the fact that President Biden has been increasingly hawkish toward China, McCarthy and other Republicans are pushing the administration to be tougher and have established a China committee to focus on issues related to Beijing. And again, dovetailing with this competition narrative, one of the explicit purposes of setting up this House China Select Committee is specifically to monitor China's technological and economic and military progress, and to figure out how the United States can counter that. Everything that we do encircling them and preparing for war and having a ring of bases and planes and drones and these nuclear submarines and aircraft carrier strike groups that are constantly going into the South China Sea, and these guided missile destroyers and other warships that we sail through the Taiwan Strait every month. And the fact that we have troops openly deployed to Taiwan now since last year, when Tsai Ing-wen revealed that in an interview with CNN. She's the president of Taiwan. It doesn't matter what Biden does. We're just countering China by monitoring their progress economically and technologically. And then we try to cripple their chip industry and prevent other countries from even doing business with them to, alleviate to help them get some sort of work around these sanctions. It's absolutely incredible. but this is sort of the rhetoric we're dealing with. Of course, we're preparing for war, but it's just competition. It's not conflict, and we're merely countering China. Whereas if they did these kinds of things that we do on a daily basis in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea and the Taiwan Strait, we would have already gone to World War III with China. All right, so here's the next piece. This is from NORAD Commander. Chinese balloons that entered U.S. under Trump went undetected. And this is from February 6th by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So the head of the North American Aerospace Defense Command claimed on Monday that Chinese balloons that entered U.S. airspace during the Trump administration weren't detected by the command, which is responsible for airspace protection of Canada and the continental United States. Quote, as NORAD commander, it's my responsibility to detect threats to North America. And this is General Glenn Van Herk, who also heads U.S. Northern Command, NORTHCOM. I will tell you that we did not detect those threats. And that's a domain awareness gap that we have to figure out. During a briefing over the weekend, Pentagon officials said similar balloons entered U.S. airspace 3 times during the Trump administration, a claim that was strongly denied by President Trump and his former top officials. But Van Herk and other U.S. military officials insist it did happen, and that the balloon activity was only discovered after Trump left office. The U.S. on Saturday shot down the alleged surveillance balloon, which Beijing insists was a weather balloon that only had a civilian purpose. China criticized the decision to down the balloon with an F-22, calling it an obvious overreaction and a serious violation of international practice. The U.S. is currently working to recover the balloon debris off the coast of South Carolina. Chinese officials said that they kept close communication with the U.S. over the incident, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken still canceled his trip to China because of the balloon. The balloon is not the first time surveillance aircraft or alleged surveillance aircraft sparked a diplomatic crisis between the U.S. and China. On April 1st, 2001, the Hainan Island incident, we had a U.S. spy plane colliding with a Chinese fighter jet off the coast of Hainan Island in the South China Sea. The American pilot had to land in Chinese territory, and the Chinese pilot went missing and is presumed dead. In 2021, for context, everybody's, the Hawks, like you were discussing, especially as as our great colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Pat McFarland, points out in his recent column about the hysteria over the Chinese balloon and putting it in context. It's really, truly nuts to see, particularly people like Jack Posobiec and Matt Gaetz, and I believe he quotes Marjorie Taylor Greene in there at length, and a lot of these populists. They're faux populists really at the end of the day, but they're sort of urging for these drastic, aggressive responses to something that could literally just be a weather balloon. And they're like, I think it was Posobiec who's saying that we should shoot it down and then scramble, bombers from Guam and send them towards China. And he goes, that's what you do when the country is threatened. And he contrasts this with the neoconservative spokesman in the Senate, if there ever was one, Lindsey Graham, who's over here looking like a moderate next to them because he's saying things like, maybe we should recover the debris and see what this really was. They say it's a weather balloon. The Pentagon says it's a spying a surveillance balloon. Let's take a look and see what it really is. And so it just shows how much, really, the American people have just become absorbed with this hawkishness to the point where Lindsey Graham, the architect of the Fortress Taiwan policy with his counterpart in the Democratic Party, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, I'm not even sure has remarked about the balloon yet, these guys, again, at least rhetorically, look like moderates. And it creates this sort of atmosphere where the American people feel humiliated and violated and vulnerable when they really don't have the context. So I wanted to point out that, in 2021, the U.S. flew over 2,000 sorties of reconnaissance aircraft near China's coast over the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the East China Sea. That's, multiple times we're doing this every single day. Last year, between January and November, according to the South China Sea Strategic Situation Probing Initiative, which keeps track of all of this, the U.S. sent 589 large warplanes to conduct close-in intelligence gathering over the South China Sea alone. And last year, on June 3rd, an American RC-135C large reconnaissance aircraft flew over the East China Sea and came as close as 90 nautical miles from Shanghai. So again, really, the American people need to hear the context on all this before it's too late. Okay, so now, but this is important. So there's a piece from Responsible Statecraft that Connor Eccles has put out called "Americans Are Far Less Hawkish on North Korea and China Than Policy Elites." And this is a very interesting poll conducted by the Harris Poll organization. So he says a large majority of Americans support talks aimed at reducing tensions with North Korea and China. So there may be hope yet. The results are at odds with the state of opinion in Washington, where policy elites continue to one-up each other over how to respond to an incident in which an apparent Chinese surveillance balloon flew over the U.S. in recent days. 2/3 of respondents agreed that the U.S. should, quote, engage in dialogue as much as possible to reduce tensions with China, while 20% said Washington should not restart official dialogue and instead spend more money on military buildup. Support for talks focused on de-escalation have gone up 5 points since 2021 when Harris last asked the question. Meanwhile, 68% of Americans polled told Harris that President Joe Biden should offer to hold direct talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and 58% said that the United States should offer diplomatic or economic incentives in exchange for steps toward denuclearization. In Washington, optimistic views of China's geopolitical rise have soured in recent years, as demonstrated by the ongoing controversy over what appears to be a Chinese surveillance balloon. While some experts, including Pentagon officials, were quick to point out that the Chinese balloon posed no threat, the incident caused an uproar among many foreign policy elites, which no doubt contributed to Secretary of State Antony Blinken's decision to postpone a scheduled trip to Beijing this past weekend. I actually just saw the other day on Neil Cavuto's show on Fox Business, there's a high-ranking guy over there at the America First Policy Institute, which is Fred Fleitz is the vice chairman over there. He's John Bolton's longtime right-hand man. And this is essentially supposed to be sort of the PNAC, the would-be sort of PNAC for Donald Trump's presumed second term beginning in 2025, if he did win re-election. And so these guys would have all the major cabinet officials picked out and all the policies laid out. And this guy, General Keith Kellogg, used to be the national security advisor for Mike Pence. And I saw him on the Cavuto show yesterday saying that we should take the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier and basically have it do laps around Taiwan, just circle Taiwan for days. So this is the kind of rhetoric we're getting from the so-called experts and from the think tanks and the officials who are in the position to have, like vice president's ears, especially on the right. So as far as North Korea, Biden has balked at the idea of changing U.S. policy toward the isolated state, opting instead to leave severe sanctions in place while expanding military cooperation with South Korea. And increased tensions with Russia and China have largely pushed issues related to North Korea, not to mention Iran, to the periphery of policymaking conversations. Harris conducted the online survey from January 17th to the 19th on behalf of the American Friends Service Committee, a prominent Quaker anti-war organization. The results are weighted to be representative based on a sample of 2,063 American adults. The pollsters also found increased support for establishing a diplomatic presence in North Korea since 2021, when a slim majority of respondents, previously 52%, approved the idea. Notably, Americans seem to have warmed to the idea that the U.S. should formally end the Korean War by seeking a full peace agreement to replace the ceasefire accord that has largely held since 1953. Slightly more than half, 52% of respondents endorsed such a policy, an 11-point jump since 2021. All right, now there's a very important piece here from Daniel Larison on his Substack, Eunomia, and it's called The Toxic Effects of Great Power Competition. And so it sort of caught my eye here because I think it gives us an idea of where Joe Biden got his idea to call for national unity and using China as the object of our hate and our competition and all these sorts of things. I mean, so Robert Kagan recently wrote a essay for the Wall Street Journal where he said, if ever there could be a cure for American political polarization, a conflict with China would be it. We've seen remarks from neoconservatives like this before. Josh Rogan, for the Washington Post, columnist at the Washington Post, wrote last year about how basically the thing is the left side of America, and he really means liberal Democrats, but the left side of America hates Russia. And they want to expand NATO to Finland and Sweden, and they want to double down on military support for Ukraine and intelligence support, and they want to increase, the amount, the billions of dollars, the hundreds of billions. They want to increase all of our arms shipments to Ukraine and sanctions on Russia and everything else, and really go after Moscow. Whereas the other half of the country, the right side of the country, is looking to send military aid to Taiwan. They want to offer a full-fledged defense commitment to Taiwan, expand in the Asia Pacific, sanction China, and decouple with them. And he talks about how he goes, basically he prefers if the population took his view and wanted to, cover all those policies, pursue all these policies, and be hawkish, equally hawkish against Russia and China. And his point was, but even if the people can't come to an agreement here, at least we have responsible members of Congress in both houses who are behind all of these policies, all these projects. And so what Spencer Ackerman, the author of Reign of Terror, gets into by analyzing this quote from Kagan. He says, of all the terrible arguments for coalescing China-Cold War, this one is perhaps the worst. U.S. policymakers must never be allowed to believe this, since if they do, they'll pursue confrontation with China as a means of political power. I can tell you from writing Reign of Terror that many politicians, journalists, and intellectuals convinced themselves after 9/11 that the war on terror would be a force through which a history-chastened America would put away childish disputes and reclaim its destiny. We know thoroughly how false it is. It's measured in an unknown number of lives ruined, freedom stolen, demagogues empowered, and anti-democratic forces mobilized. The China-Cold War won't redress that. It would scale it all up. The cure for American political polarization will not include your Asian American neighbors any more than post 9/11 national unity included your Muslim neighbors. So Larison says, every time the U.S. embarks on some major struggle against an enemy, the loudest supporters trot out this conceit that it will have a great unifying effect on the country. To the extent that there is briefly a period of unity, it is imposed through smashing dissent, vilifying and abusing whichever minorities are perceived as being too sympathetic to the other side, and a culture defined by fear and conformity. The truth is that such conflicts exacerbate existing divisions and create new ones within the country, especially when they involve sending U.S. forces off to fight in some distant country that has nothing to do with American security. Supposing the rivalry with China remains a cold one, the picture is still an ugly one. In prolonged rivalries, wartime hysteria and paranoia become near permanent features of the political landscape. Partisan sniping and demagoguery predictably get worse during periods of intensified rivalry with another major power. And hawks routinely accuse their domestic opponents of disloyalty, appeasement, and defeatism. As Ackerman says, all this should be obvious from the experience of the last 2 decades when all of this happened as part of the war on terror. But it is important for an ideologue like Kagan to bury the memory of the last disastrous war so that he can sell the new one. And so Larison says the recent panic over the dreaded spy balloon is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. If an incident as relatively minor and harmless as this one can send Washington into convulsions, we can expect much worse when there is a serious incident that involves U.S. and Chinese forces. There is no sign of the political unity that the hardliners promise anywhere to be found. Instead, you have the Speaker of the House screeching about the president's failure to act sooner and denouncing the atrocity of a balloon passing overhead. Hyper-competitiveness is one of the pathologies of U.S. foreign policy. Framing U.S.-China relations primarily in terms of a competition that the U.S. must win, as the president did on Tuesday, feeds that pathology and seems certain to produce misguided and dangerous policies that will have serious costs for the country and perhaps for the entire world. Chris Fetweiss discussed this at length in The Pathologies of Power in his chapter on the pathology of glory. In fact, he says, a good case can be made that competitiveness is even more destructive for a country than it is for a person, whether it be in security, economics, or social realms. While competition may drive people to excel in certain respects, it has corrosive and harmful effects. For one thing, it makes the competitors more aggressive and belligerent. Fettweis writes, like the credibility imperative, competition increases belligerent behavior and discourages cooperation. Competition also breeds distrust and causes competitors to assume the worst about their rivals. Fettweis concludes that the consequences for foreign policy of the continuing importance of glory are, however, uniformly pathological. One of the pitfalls of the defining relationship with China in terms of such competition is that the more intensively that both of our countries compete for dominance, the more likely it is that everyone will lose and end up worse off than we are now. Even if the rivalry doesn't lead to war, and even if such a war doesn't escalate to a nuclear exchange, we will all be poorer and less secure, with more of our resources wasted on military buildups that could have been used for other purposes. The danger is that a rivalry defined by competition that we supposedly will have to win will sooner or later escalate into a direct conflict, because the prospect of losing will be intolerable to the people invested in pursuing the rivalry. The problem is the zero-sum competitive framing itself, and if we don't get rid of it, our country will end up in a much worse position in the future. And that's very important as we see Pentagon budgets nearing $900 billion a year. Traditionally, you can just calculate the Pentagon budget by 2 to get the real national security budget when you include interest on previous wars and spending, the VA, the entire, the national, all the ancillaries of the Department of Homeland Security, the Energy Department's care and feeding of the nuclear program, this $1 trillion plus build up to revamp the entire nuclear weapons stockpile. Nuclear weapons arsenal. We are spending so much on war and on so-called defense, and it's almost always justified now by pointing to the China threat. And really, what China is trying to do is that their foreign policy is one of they call it access denial. They're essentially creating a defensive posture as we continue to encircle them. I mean, this is the Asia pivot here is the largest military buildup since World War II. It was launched by the likes of Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama. There's no reason for the Republicans to be supporting this. It's impoverishing the American people here who are already dealing with the effects of the inflation and the horrible monetary policies that funded all the previous wars that they may have supported in the past and turned on their neighbors and called them traitors for being skeptical of in the past, especially when it comes to things like the Iraq War. But now there is an undercurrent in the right wing that it leans toward non-interventionism, and hopefully that can be exploited in the future for good purposes, of course. And they make a great point here about how it makes it impossible for you to have diplomacy, especially in the context. We can see it very easily with Russia, how the Russiagate narrative really greased the skids and prepared the American people to go to war with Russia for all intents and purposes only 7 years later. And so it's very good to see these polls come out to show that the American people, at least in this instance, because I remember we came up across a poll a couple of years ago that showed, I believe, something like half the American population was considering or supportive of defending Taiwan militarily in the event of an attack. And so to see that we now have large numbers of Americans who want to see diplomacy, I don't think it will have any effect on the Biden administration, but it's good to see the American people feel this way, and hopefully that can be used to put some real pressure here on both parties. But unfortunately, it looks like there's an allergy to diplomacy, and we're not going to get anything better than we've had for quite some time.
All right, Connor. Well, thanks for letting the show end with a little bit of good news, if you read between the lines this week, and we'll try to build on that. But anyways, thanks everybody so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows next week.